Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's session, Advanced Energy Policy Presentations, featuring some of our Veterans Advanced Energy Fellows. I'm Margaret Jackson, the Deputy Director for Climate and Advanced Energy at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. It is a pleasure to host you this week, and it's really been nice to get to know a lot of you over the course of this week so far. I know that we have a packed agenda, and I hope you were able to tune in for our programming earlier today on decarbonizing the electricity system, the future of transportation, the role of nuclear in net zero, and our fireside chat with Senator Braun. Please keep in mind that you can rewatch any of these sessions or watch sessions that you might have missed through the conference app. I hope you have also been able to take part in our recruiting sessions with participating companies. They are very generously taking their time to share information about their companies, employment opportunities, and many are also featuring veteran employees who are interested in sharing their stories. So please check out the upcoming sessions over the next 2 days, as well as a specific networking opportunity in partnership with Solar Ready Vets Career Connect on Thursday. Finally, I'd also like to put in a plug for our resume feature where you can upload your resume into a database that's available to participating company recruiters. One information relevant to tonight that I would like to highlight is for our Veterans Advanced Energy Fellowship. We have a session tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. where you can learn more. You can also check out, again, our conference app feature that has more information as well as a link to the application, which is due on August 16th. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce this special program this evening. It's going to feature the hard work of our fellows over the course of this last year. And I have to take a minute to just say how incredibly talented this group is. They come from every corner of the United States and every corner of the advanced energy field. I have learned so much from them, from their various areas of expertise, and it's really been a privilege in helping them gain a deeper understanding of the energy policymaking process. I know that you're going to enjoy hearing their unique and innovative ideas tonight about how to make meaningful progress on the energy transition, and I hope you leave inspired. Now, I'm delighted to turn the floor over to Dan Mish, the founder and co-director of the Veterans Advanced Energy Project, who is also a Navy veteran, as we know. He will be the moderator for this evening's event. Dan, take it away.
Thank you, Maggie. As Maggie said, my name is Dan Mish, and I am the founder and co-director of the Veterans Advanced Energy Project. I am pleased to be joined this evening by 4 of our very own Veteran Advanced Energy Fellows. The Fellows have been working on policy proposals over the past year with support and advice from experts across the Atlantic Council network. The full set of proposals was published last week, and I will share that link in the chat for you all to read and reference. Coming into the 3rd year, the Veterans Advanced Energy Fellowship serves to create a cadre of future leaders within the advanced energy industry through monthly educational webinars, policy writing and public speaking exercises, and community building events throughout the country. As Maggie mentioned, applications are open until August 16th, and there is an information session tomorrow at 3:30 Eastern. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. This event is on the record, and we are currently live streaming on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about what you hear today and share on social media using the hashtag VetsEnergyWeek. And if you would like to participate in the conversation, we encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A portal located at the bottom of your screen. Our 4 fellows are Jonathan Gillis, presenting on incentive programs for U.S. domestic battery manufacturing; Jesse Medlong, presenting on the Light Work Initiative; Taylor Searcy, presenting on port decarbonization; and Robin Tyner, presenting on kinetic hydro energy use in remote U.S. locations. Our 4 fellows will each present their idea, which is about 5 minutes, and then I will be moderating a few questions from the audience. You can use the Q&A function to send us your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to John Gillis to get us started, and take it away, John.
Dan, thanks so much, and many thanks to the Atlantic Council folks for such a great fellowship. I'm going to bring up a slide deck here, and I think you should be able to see that now. So I want to take just 5 minutes today to talk about a way that I think that we can help return U.S. battery manufacturing. Battery manufacturing, as you know, is particularly important for the electrified future. Everybody right now knows how important it is because we're using them currently. lithium-ion batteries are in our cell phones, in our computers, but increasingly they are in our transportation infrastructure and in our homes. And so as you can imagine, this is particularly important for national security for two reasons, rather. One, because disruptions to lithium-ion supply chains can interrupt our daily lives, and we've seen that from COVID supply chain disruptions. But secondly, because supply chain disruptions for military applications can prevent us from being able to execute missions appropriately. As many people know, there's a looming figure in lithium-ion battery manufacturing, and that's China. China controls almost every part of the lithium-ion value chain, but they're particularly dominant actually in the lower, the later half of the value chain. So we hear a lot in the U.S. right now about upstream and mining. As you can see from this graphic here, it's actually the lower or the later stages of the value chain in which China really excels. So a challenge that we're posed with in the United States is how to bring that back. And so what I want to suggest today is that grid storage is a potential near-term pathway to do so, perhaps more so than electric vehicles. I'll come back to why I think grid storage is a great candidate and why it complements electric vehicle policies right now. But I want to just highlight the two incentives that I think that we need to put in place in order to make that happen. The first one would be a standalone storage investment tax credit. For those familiar with solar, you know the investment tax credit has been particularly important to the growth of solar. An ITC for storage would be especially important as well. And then secondly, a Made in America incentive. And this would be an incentive for buying American-made batteries, which could also help bring closer the difference between the cost to produce in China versus the cost to produce in the US. So if you look at this graphic right here, really what I'm showing is that there's kind of three stages that work in a virtuous cycle, and that we need to enhance this virtuous cycle in order to bring manufacturing back to the US. The first stage is demand growth. Demand growth can fuel your domestic manufacturing because there's a place for that product to go. Supply chain development follows demand growth. So where there's lots of demand, there's lots of opportunity to innovate in supply chains, and that ultimately leads to cost reductions. As things become cheaper, as you can imagine, demand grows as well. There was a policy, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009, passed by the Obama administration, that sought to bring domestic manufacturing back by inserting cash directly into supply chain development. So they gave funds directly to battery manufacturers in hopes that by doing so, they would reduce the costs. The problem was early stage battery manufacturing has a lot of quality challenges, and it's also very expensive. But there also wasn't a demand signal at the time in the US for that product. And so what happened was these companies took federal funds, they developed new factories, et cetera. Ultimately, they didn't have any demand in the US, they went bankrupt, and unfortunately ended up selling to China in many cases. And so this is a good example of why stimulating just with supply chain development, basically inserting cash at the point of manufacturing, doesn't necessarily solve our problem. So the real question is, well, how did China end up doing this? Well, China did three things very, very well. First of all, back in the 1990s, China commercialized US research. They did this not by stealing it necessarily, but in fact, because for business decisions, we exported manufacturing to China. After they received that manufacturing, they established themselves as a top exporter, and they've continued that trend. But they also built a domestic backstop. So they built that demand internally, especially with their electric vehicle market. And you can see that with this graphic here. If you look on the right, the black is the global electric light vehicle sales by region, and China obviously dominates this market. You can see the United States, while growing, is still fairly small compared to China. So that brings me back to grid storage. Why grid storage instead of electric vehicles? Well, China right now is spending $15 billion annually on electric vehicle incentives, which is more, at least by my count, than the US has spent over the last 10 years. And so China's growth, which is in some sense premised on electric vehicle growth, really it would be difficult to replicate in the United States because we would have to incentivize electric vehicles to such an enormous degree. And the infrastructure is not really in place right now, as many of you know. So in the absence of growth for electric vehicles, which is going to come but probably won't come for some time, grid storage can be a wonderful substitute for that. for two reasons. First of all, it's needed to balance renewables, especially as we have increasing renewables. And secondly, because each grid storage development is basically, you could think of it as the size of an electric vehicle fleet. And so it's almost like electrifying quickly, you're just doing it in a different way. Grid storage also has two large benefits. The first one is that it's less restrictive on weight, size, and energy density requirements. This means that early stage, lower quality product, which might be more expensive, might have quality challenges, isn't going into the hands of driving consumers. It's sort of isolated into grid storage, where potentially there's a little bit more of a willingness to endure some sort of quality challenges or weight challenges. And secondly, it's less sensitive to individual preferences. Electric vehicles, while they have many fans, they also have a lot of detractors in the US, and people are particularly price sensitive. So high EV prices will continue to keep some folks away for a while. So I want to come back again and say, if we want to enhance grid storage in the United States, we need to put two policies in place. The first one is the investment tax credit, which makes it cheaper to invest in grid storage overall. And secondly, a Made in America incentive, and that makes sure that when we invest in storage, we're buying American product rather than Chinese product. And ultimately, what that's doing is inserting into the demand growth and the cost reduction portion of this virtuous cycle. So you can think of it almost like driving with both hands on the wheel. We have more control over what the final outcome is. And I think in conjunction with electric vehicle sales growth over the long run, it's a promising way to bring manufacturing back to the US. So thank you very much.
John, that's fantastic. Thank you. I am now going to, just as I said, put the full set of proposals in the chat function and remind people that they can enter their questions in the Q&A function. We haven't received any questions yet, so I'm just going to start with my own, which is, have you considered how companies will qualify for the Made in America incentive, considering that so many of the raw materials will need to come from other countries? Or should we also be incentivizing the raw material production as well?
I think that's a great and a very challenging question. I think that there's probably a lot of discussion that needs to be had around that. What I would say is that if you are solidly in the U.S. on one stage of the value chain, that brings value back to the U.S. and so therefore you should in some way qualify for that incentive. Whether it's sourcing, which I think we can do in some parts of the country, or refining, which we may have the ability to do in a larger portion of the country. But if you're solidly in the U.S. at one stage of the value chain, I think it brings value back to the U.S.
That's great. Again, for the audience members, please enter your questions into the Q&A here. And John, I want to talk more about the electric vehicle. Are you dismissing it entirely? I realize, the scope of your proposal may be limited to grid, but is there any chance that the U.S. can compete with China on the electric vehicle front?
I think that in the long run, the U.S. is going to be able to compete, but in the short run, the cost of the vehicles is still fairly high, and China has the benefit of having tremendous subsidies. So there's things that we have to iron out in the U.S. that I think will be ironed out over the coming years. But to give one example, if you look in cities, there's a vast number of vehicles in cities, but most people who charge electric vehicles charge at home. They don't charge at public infrastructure, and most people in cities are renters that don't have access to public charging or home charging. And so electrifying cities, for example, becomes much harder in this way. So the EV growth EV growth projections, I think, haven't necessarily paid attention to the challenge of electrifying without the infrastructure in place. And as we iron that out, I think we'll probably see a boom in it. But I'm hesitant to say that the boom is maybe as soon as some other folks have argued that it might be.
Got it. Thank you very much. Well, John, thank you for your comments. And with that, we're going to head over to the next presentation, which is from Jesse Medlong. And Jesse, you will have to unmute yourself.
Unmuting now, thanks. Hold on one moment, please. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Not yet. coming up. I see your desktop, and I see your presentation.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dan, and thank you to everyone at the Atlantic Council and the Veterans Advanced Energy Project. It's been a real thrill and extremely educational to be part of this program, and so thank you very much for all that you've done in hosting it. I'm introducing today the Lightwork Initiative. My name is Jesse Medlong. I am a sustainability lawyer and climate diplomat at DLA Piper, a global law firm, where I am headquartered in San Francisco. And so without further ado, with humanity hurtling toward climate cataclysm, sustainability is survival, and survival is good for business. Like other big businesses, large professional services employers tout their sustainability commitments and roll out net zero greenhouse gas pledges. But during the pandemic, these companies reduced their GHG emissions, at least in part, by outsourcing them to their employees working remotely. Maybe the employee can shave off some consumption with efficiency measures, but can these individual employees, people like you and me, really make a dent in a problem of this enormity? The question is not whether we can make that difference by ourselves, but whether we can make that difference together. Corporate activity, not individual behavior, is the largest contributor to climate change. Although a few dozen companies can change their behavior more readily than billions of individuals, corporate changes require individual action. Think about it like this. Climate change is a collective action problem. We can only solve it in concert. It's kind of like vaccinating to achieve herd immunity. Everyone together is best, but most will do. When immunizing against man-made climate change, businesses and individuals are part of the same herd. We don't have a planet B. We're all in it together. So what is the relationship of these corporate and corporal actors in addressing climate change? As more companies make binding commitments to align their GHG emissions with a habitable Earth, we can thank individual decision makers. Companies meet those commitments because flesh and blood humans change their behavior. Behind each corporate act is a mosaic of individual actors. We, the people, are the investors, customers, employees, and voters driving this change. Consider one of these stakeholder groups, employees. For professional services firms, employees are the principal source of revenue and emissions. When these companies commit to cut emissions, they must resolve two distinct challenges. The first is to promote employees' revenue generating potential. The second is to reduce emissions from employees' pursuit of that revenue. With the widespread adoption of telework during the pandemic, companies could resolve those challenges by cutting the Gordian knot. Professional services firms have maintained and even increased profitability while effectively outsourcing their emissions to employees working at home. But with companies competing to prove their sustainability, a wide range of stakeholders want them to do so by reducing their emissions, not merely making them someone else's, their workers' problem. This is where the Lightwork Initiative, or LWI, comes in. Taken from the old adage that many hands make light work, Lightwork stands for linking incentives and technology to empower worker ownership, reduction, and knowledge of energy consumption and its impacts. Here's how it works. The LWI has three components. First, a participating firm partners with local utilities to obtain home energy audits for employees to identify opportunities to improve efficiency and reduce energy consumption. Second, the firm allocates a fixed stipend to subsidize each employee's purchase and installation of residential smart grid technology and efficiency improvements. And third, the firm partners with a third-party provider like OhmConnect or Virimoto to analyze usage and reward reductions. Participants could earn points for reduced consumption, which can then be spent on more efficiency technology, but also household goods and apparel, donations to favorite charities, and chances to win prizes ranging from home exercise equipment to family vacations. LWI serves employees by subsidizing efficiency technology, teaching and facilitating good practices, and saving them money on their energy bills. LWI serves society at large by contributing to reduced emissions and to more resilient energy grids. But what's in it for the employer? Quite a lot. First, there's reputational value. For firms seeking to distinguish themselves from their peers, LWI just looks good. Second, LWI reduces indirect emissions from the firm's value chain, so-called Scope 3 emissions. Many big investors expect their portfolio companies to report and reduce Scope 3 emissions. And regulators and legislators are moving forward with emissions reporting and reduction requirements. LWI meets these expectations where they are and anticipates where they're going. And third, because professional services firms' emissions are part of their clients' Scope 3 emissions, clients increasingly consider emissions when choosing service providers. LWI is not a magic bullet, but it's also not merely a gimmick. It brings together the companies that can make a difference in the world with the individuals who can make a difference in the companies. Overcoming climate change is the heaviest challenge humanity has ever faced. The only way to lighten it is to live together. Thanks.
Jesse, that was great. Thank you very much. For our audience members here today, I just want to remind you that we are taking questions. So use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen here to ask Jesse any of your questions about his presentation. I'll just get us kicked off by asking, with the pandemic and so many people working from home, how has that shaped this proposal that you've been thinking about, and how might it be changing the way that people think about their own electricity use while we're spending more time in our homes?
Well, I think it's fair to say, Dan, that I would not have come up with this idea had I not been working from home during the pandemic. So it has certainly helped inspire the idea, and it has shaped it. I think, though, that it's fair to say that a lot of professional services firms, at least looking at my own experience as a lawyer, had employees working from home even before the pandemic. And so what the pandemic has done is change our expectation about working from home. It's not so much that it's changed anything about that people do it. It might make it more consistent or more commonplace, but it's not really new. But I do think that more than just a pandemic solution, LWI is a solution for the future. The pandemic has changed what we expect work from home to be like going forward. And so as companies increasingly look to make real world reductions in their emissions, they have to do so by addressing the workers who make those emissions, even when they're not in the office.
And I do have a question from the audience, which is, how do you incentivize the clients of these firms to reduce their demand for in-person interaction, since you're proposing this for professional service firms that will have a client demand, and for those who choose to meet clients where they are will outcompete those who won't?
Well, I have two answers. I think it's a fantastic question. And first, just because I have a job that requires me to be in touch with clients sometimes. And sometimes I imagine at some point, the restrictions on in-person appearance in court, for instance, will change, and courts will expect you to be in person. So there's some perhaps irreducible amount of face time that will be involved. But that doesn't mean that all of the rest of the time you're meeting with clients or going to court. There are lots and lots of times, especially lawyers spend a lot of time at their desks doing this work, working on computers, and that's not going to change. And so I don't think it's as much of a tension as you might think. And also, it's the clients who are demanding these reductions. And so we have to be able to demonstrate to our clients that we're seriously committed to reducing these emissions. And we can't do that by just saying, well, I've put my employees at home, and so I've wiped them off of my balance sheet. Or to the extent you can, so can everyone else. And so when in a very competitive market like the professional services market, being able to say, yes, but we're different, and we do it like this because we see real differences and real results, that's a key differentiator for a firm like mine.
Yeah, and on that note, I have one more question for you from the audience, which is, in a tightening labor market, would LWI make a participating firm a more attractive employer for an employee with similar values?
I absolutely believe it's the case. And, as somebody who's helping to spearhead my firm's efforts on ESG and sustainability, it is a fact that when we're recruiting talent, being able to say how we are different as a global organization it's immense. And I've seen over the years of my practice, I have a deep commitment to pro bono. That's the kind of thing that new candidates are always asking me about. And that's because when we put it out there, we find out that candidates, the new talent that wants to come in because of those kinds of differentiating factors.
That's great. Well, Jesse, thank you very much. At this time, we're going to move to our next speaker. So Taylor Searcy, over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan. And thank you to the Atlantic Council and Veterans Advanced Energy Project. I've had a wonderful experience, and it's been an honor. I'm humbled by fellows such as Jesse and others. Without further ado, let me share my screen. Try to get this up right. Where did it go? All right, can you see my screen?
I sure can.
Okay, so we've heard some great ideas so far, and I think we can all agree that climate change is a significant challenge that we face as society. And I think we could also all agree that the United States has a role to play in stepping up to be a leader in the clean energy transition. One area I want to focus on in particular is ports. And I believe we can achieve in the US a goal of 100% port decarbonization by 2035. That might seem kind of ambitious, but let me explain how we could do it. First of all, we need an effective interagency port decarbonization policy, spearheaded by a triad of leaders at the federal level, primarily the Department of Energy, but also significant players would be the EPA and Department of Transportation, as well as a myriad other agencies. There's lots of different policy instruments and tools that are needed, but the three things that are paramount are incentives tied to port electrification for things such as cargo handling equipment and shore power for at-berth vessels. The second is regulations. We need stringent air quality standards for criteria pollutants such as sulfur oxides, nitrous oxides, particulate matter. And then the third, the only way to make this happen effectively is through collaboration or the development of strong local and regional partnerships. You might be wondering why ports, why now? Recently, the Biden administration announced in its American Jobs Plan the allocation of at least $17 billion towards port infrastructure and the development of a healthy ports program. And I believe this could all be tied to a goal of developing clean energy infrastructure towards decarbonization of the ports. There's bipartisan support in Congress through the Problem Solvers Caucus that calls for upwards of $25 billion towards the same. So there's definitely a will. It's just a matter of having effective policy from the federal government. So why ports? Also, as a Navy veteran, I'm sure some of you out there are Navy veterans. I've spent countless hours at sea and I've been in and out of ports around the world. I always find it fascinating that virtually everything you own has at one point or another transited a port. They're major economic hubs vital to coastal communities. In the US alone, ports move goods valued at 26% of our total GDP. Second, we need to think of ports and the surrounding communities. The neighborhoods around ports are primarily low-income communities of color that suffer disproportionately from the effects of climate change and the significant at-berth emissions that the port creates. Finally, by focusing on clean energy infrastructure for ports, this can catalyze the hard-to-abate shipping sector, which, if you put it in perspective, the shipping industry accounts for nearly the same amount of GHG emissions as Germany. So it's a significant contributor to climate change, and that's a bigger challenge that'll take longer. But ports can catalyze that broader change. And you might be thinking, 2035, that's extremely ambitious. How can we get anything done in a short amount of time like that at this scale? And I believe it can and must be done. For millennia, sail was the primary means of moving people and goods around the world. It's free, clean wind. In the 1870s, coal quickly took over, but in the 1910s, relatively in the blink of an eye, diesel became the primary marine fuel. And it's stayed that way more or less ever since. If you look at the rate of other technology adoptions, the pace of change is only accelerating. So something at as such a grand scale of decarbonizing all of our ports can be done in a short time. Now let's think of one example in particular to put this in perspective, the Port of Los Angeles. Together with the neighboring Port of Long Beach, this is the single largest port complex in the United States. It's notoriously described as a diesel death zone for the heavy particulate matter, and the EPA has labeled it an air quality non-attainment zone. So I don't know about you, but I would not want to be standing at that port today if you see those pictures breathing toxic airs. But with effective policy, if you look to 2035, I believe we could transform a port such as Los Angeles to a zero emissions port that's connected to a grid powered entirely by clean, renewable sources of energy. The surrounding community would be breathing clean, healthy air, and it'd be vibrant, not only vibrant, but thriving thanks to the thousands of well-paid jobs needed to deploy and install this clean energy infrastructure. All of the vessels calling on these ports, regardless of the flags they fly, would be emitting zero emissions while at berth in these ports. So again, to make this happen, we need a lot of different instruments, but primarily I want to focus on the money that's needed, and incentives are one way that's been very successful in the US Navy, for example, to incentivize shore power installation and electrification of port equipment, such as cranes and forklifts. And regulations. California is a great example of at-berth regulations. In the past 5 years, they've achieved an 80% reduction in at-berth emissions from container ships, reefers, and cruise ships. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, is effective collaboration across numerous fronts. But one example that I think has been an outstanding success so far is Washington Maritime Blue in the Pacific Northwest, which has spurred innovation in the broader blue economy. So with that, I want to leave with a final thought to all of you to consider ports as potential green gateways that will enable our broader shift towards a clean energy future and a soon-to-be decarbonized world. Thank you.
Thanks, Taylor. So just as a reminder for the audience, we are taking questions for Taylor now, and I'll just kick us off by asking, are there any stories of success here, either from the US or around the world, maybe certain countries that have enacted priorities to decarbonize their ports?
Yeah, there are several examples. Actually, the Port of Los Angeles, even though I use that as an example of a port I might not want to stand at today, has actually had a resounding success. They are part of a global forum on port sustainability, and of the ports around the world, I think there's about 10 of them. The majority are in Europe, but the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, together with the California at-berth air regulations, has actually achieved remarkable success in electrifying their cargo handling equipment and their and installing shore power. So it's one example that I was just using as a major port, but other ports in Europe are actually far ahead of the US. The Port of Rotterdam is a great example of that.
And how can the emerging infrastructure bill, if enacted, be leveraged to decarbonize US ports?
That is a great question. So I could think of a few things, but first I wanted to mention the three agencies I talked about, Department of Energy, EPA, and DOT. They all have at some agency under their umbrella, they have some type of funding allocated toward port infrastructure. So the EPA has the Ports Initiative, which provides DERA grants, Diesel Emission Reduction Act grants, about $46 million. Department of Transportation has a Maritime Environmental and Technical Assistance Program. but it's kind of, as many things in a large bureaucracy, it's kind of dis, discontinuous. It's not coordinated very well. So a lot of ports and utilities that service ports do not have the necessarily direction or resources to tie into these grants. So I think by leveraging, if enacted, the $17 billion allocated toward port infrastructure and defining what's right now, there is no definition of the Healthy Ports Program. By having the DOE, EPA, and DOT define that and come up with a metric to tie all of the investment into clean energy infrastructure, we could achieve this port decarbonization goal.
Thank you. And one last question, Taylor. What is the cost benefit analysis of reducing the emissions from ports versus the shipping itself? And are there feasible technical solutions to decarbonizing the ships?
Both questions are great. The first one, I do not have a good answer on, but I will say ports are, in the grand scheme of things, ports are relatively minor when it comes to decarbonization. The ships themselves are heavy emitters, and the International Maritime Organization is relatively behind the curve of implementing any international shipping regulations that would be stringent enough to achieve decarbonization. For the second part of that question, I was on a call earlier today about this very topic, and there's a lot of different things in motion right now for international shipping, if that's what the question was primarily focused on. The only real solution that would take upwards of 30 years probably to implement is by either deploying hydrogen or ammonia to serve as a marine fuel.
Thank you. Thank you, Taylor. So with that, we'll hand it off to our last featured speaker, Robin Tyner. Over to you.
Hey, good evening. I'm Robin Tyner, retired Navy, and currently work for oceanographer, currently work for Sonalist. And just thank you for the opportunity and for everyone in the audience. And I'm going to share my screen and so get started. So I think we can all agree that an accelerated transition away from fossil fuels.
Sorry, we're not seeing your screen yet.
You're not seeing my screen. Okay. And I don't know what to do. Share. Let me try this. How's that?
There you go.
Okay. So I think we can all agree that an accelerated transition away from fossil fuels is required to avert the worst effects of climate change and global warming, but existing renewables are not forecast to grow enough fast enough to get to our 100% goals. And a lot of cleaner technologies, there's a lot of imperfections. So, nuclear has a cost, expensive, and a waste problem. Solar is quartz mining and chemical use and land siting issues. So we have multiple imperfect solutions and kind of need to find the best combination. And perhaps one of the most green ones is largely overlooked to this point, and that's hydrokinetic power, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. Concurrently, and now I can't make my slides go, so we'll do it by hand. So concurrently, we also know that the greatest reliance of fossil fuels is often in rural or disadvantaged or indigenous communities. And under President Biden's Justice 40 initiative within the Department of Energy, they have announced a plan to deliver 40% of the overall benefits of their climate investments to disadvantaged communities. So my thought was, how do we leverage this Justice 40 initiative with the Department of Energy? And what I propose is a new Justice 40 Department of Energy program that would partner with states to deploy marine hydrokinetic energy to these remote, underdeveloped, or indigenous communities as a baseload power source to reduce reliance on dirtier fuels. And why baseload is because hydrokinetic power comes from tidal and river currents, which are very predictable, very stable, 24/7, 365. So when you have that as a baseload power source, then you can augment it with, I mean, you could augment it with coal, but you can augment it with anything and hopefully more renewable sources to get towards 100%. A little bit more about hydrokinetic power in the upper right of this slide. The horizontal axis is time, and this is looking at just tides, and the orange part is the flood tides and the ebb tides, and that's when you would generate power from tides. The little teeny bit between the oranges is slack tides, so you're not generating power then, but most of the time you are. Verdant power, there's a picture there. They last October deployed an array of 3 turbines in New York City's East River, and within the first 85 days, it generated 100 megawatts of power. So that's huge. ORPC is the other of 2 US companies that are really working this space, and they have river turbines and tidal turbines in the 2 pictures. The river one's on top on pontoons that literally just sinks into the water, and the turbines can be stacked modularly, horizontally, or vertically to fit a seabed or a riverbed space. They break down onto a flatbed truck, can be delivered anywhere, set up locally with traditional local equipment, nothing really special required. And one of these river ones has been deployed in a remote Alaskan village for several years now, under the ice, year round, through salmon fishing or salmon season. And there's been no injuries observed to fish, no deaths. The turbines move slow enough, the fish can swim right through them, over, around them, and they offset diesel use in this community by 1/3. So how would such a proposal work? So I think the Department of Energy could fund a grant program for states, and states can figure out what are the communities that would best, where this could be leveraged. And some reservations could probably work directly with the government as well. But then through these grants, we generate the marine hydrokinetic power as a base load source, and it can connect directly into an existing power grid. You could set up a microgrid, or you could use local marine battery banks. There's really a lot of options. But then once you have that as the base load, you can supplement with any other power source. Again, it could still be diesel, but at least you're cutting it down. But ideally, then you bring in the wind and the solar and other energy sources and approach that 100% renewable energy solution. So just real quick, couple examples where this could be circled is the Bay of Fundy, which is the highest tidal ranges in the world, 26-foot tides, and a very small rural community in Maine. There's a lot of power in a 26-foot tidal range. Penobscot River, large major river flowing to the sea. On the right, the purple is actually the Penobscot Indian Reservation, which is 200 islands in the river. There are river people. So this is like, to me, a win-win for them. In northern New Hampshire, major rivers. The northernmost county is more than a quarter of the state, a little over 30,000 people, and their median income is 20% below the national average, and they have really poor energy infrastructure, so more possibilities. North Dakota, the Missouri River and many major rivers going through or around 3 major Indian reservations. Similar in South Dakota, the Missouri River again, and several other major rivers in, through, and around 8 major Indian reservations. So there's infinite possibilities. I think states can really, probably determine what's best in their state. But I think with this program, Department of Energy, with the grant program, states figuring out indigenous communities, especially if they're autonomous, figuring out what works for them, get this clean base load energy to these areas that are often most reliant on fossil fuels, and just kind of make a dent and meet that Justice 40 initiative to really support the disadvantaged communities while we're working the overall U.S. climate problem. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Robin, thank you. That was excellent. Just as a reminder to our audience members, we are taking questions for Robin now, and I'll just start us off by asking about the siting issues. So you had mentioned how wind and solar have siting problems across the country. I'm not familiar with who owns rivers in the US and how siting for these is maybe easier than on land.
Well, I think it's easier because these are not taking away from other uses. Um, there's, because rivers are used for transport and then fisheries and stuff like that. But so far, they haven't had problems because they're not competing. It's not like a dam that blocks the river, and they don't have to stop flows. They don't impede the fishermen. They don't impede the fish. And so it's not really affecting any other business that's going on anywhere where they've been working with it right now. I mean, obviously, you're not going to be trolling in a place where you've got a tidal turbine at the bottom of the ocean, but I think that's just a matter of coordination. And so you're not, and because they're not permanent fixtures, they can be moved. It's not like a huge solar farm that covers acres and acres and acres, and now you've taken that away from any. You can't develop it. There's other uses that you're lost to, and that's a pretty permanent thing. But these turbines can be lowered, they can be raised, they can be moved, and it's pretty neat.
I see. We have one question from the audience, which is, how maintenance intensive are hydrokinetic power plants, and do these rural communities have the skill sets to maintain them?
They just talking with the folks mostly at ORPC, because that's where they have them in Alaska. They are intended to be able to be manned, run, equipped, maintained by the local communities, so that they can even be set up within the local community. So you don't have to have the specialized support coming in. I'm sure there's some moderate level of training, but it doesn't require their experts to be on site. It's kind of one of their pitching points when you talk to them, is that they have made it so that it can be, typical tools. Maybe you have to have a crane, but it's not specialized equipment that only works for these turbines. And that your local public works type of people, should be able to work with them to install this stuff.
I see. And so one more question before we wrap things up. Is there any impact on navigability?
Where they have put those, there's not. I think that's definitely a consideration where I don't think you want to put a tidal turbine in the shipping lane. Even if you got plenty of draft, there's just areas that you would want to avoid. But I think that's something that is you can work out. That's especially in rivers, because in rivers they found they can put these things just in a free-flowing river, in front of a dam, on the backside of a dam, and it kind of doesn't matter, because as long as the water's flowing, then you generate energy. So I think that it's easiest in rivers. I think with the tidal ones, you do have to look at ports and fishing lanes and depth of the water and figure out the right place to put it.
Okay. Robin, thank you very much. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us for this important and productive conversation during Veterans Advanced Energy Week. And specifically, thank you to our fellows for being here and sharing your perspectives. I encourage everyone to read the full set of proposals on our website. I hope you enjoyed today's talks and encourage you to check out the Veteran Advanced Energy Fellowship, with applications open until August 16th and an information session tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. If you'd like to rewatch today's events or share the stream with a colleague, replay will be available on the Atlantic Council YouTube channel and on our social media platforms. Coming up next in our conference program, tomorrow is day 3 of Veterans Advanced Energy Week. We will begin at 12 p.m. Eastern, where we will focus on U.S. clean energy leadership. The day will also feature an exclusive film screening, as well as recruiting sessions with TerraPower, San Diego Gas and Electric, and ENI. Thank you all again, and I hope to see you all there.